Ari Redboard. Welcome to TRM Talks. TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. Yesterday, the US Treasury Department released a risk assessment of decentralized finance. Today, we are joined by Caroline Horace, Senior Policy Advisor, to talk about that risk assessment. Caroline, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here and really excited to get this risk assessment out and share it and talk about it. I think it'll be, frankly, really good fodder for conversations about illicit finance and DeFi.
Terrific, yeah, and looking forward really to having the first of those conversations with you today. First, you were an author of this risk assessment. Talk to me a little bit about sort of why a DeFi risk assessment in particular, and why now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a perfect place to start. We committed to actually doing this decentralized finance, illicit finance risk assessment in the action plan to address illicit finance risks of digital assets, which was published last September pursuant to the Digital Asset Executive Order. And in the action plan and in the National Money Laundering Risk Assessment, which was published in early 2022, we had touched on the fact that DeFi could pose illicit finance risks, but we didn't really get into it in that much detail. And so we really wanted to take an opportunity to look more closely at DeFi and tease out a couple of key questions, like, what are we talking about when we say DeFi? If and how are illicit actors misusing DeFi services? And are there vulnerabilities in our AML CFT regime domestically that are enabling that to happen? I think a natural question when saying that we're doing a DeFi illicit finance risk assessment is it's a question about scale. And this assessment and the national risk assessments that were published in early 2022 did note that money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing, all of that mostly happens in fiat currency via traditional methods that don't involve virtual assets. We do recognize that within virtual assets, DeFi services are a small subset of transactions there, accounting for a pretty small percentage of overall transaction volume. And then the percentage of DeFi that's related to illicit activity is also a subset of that. So I think the scale piece is important to note, but really kind of from where we sit in government, we're constantly looking for illicit finance risks and how the threat landscape is changing. So the assessment does find that illicit actors are misusing DeFi services. And so we felt compelled to kind of write an assessment and share that, talk about the illicit finance risks and how we're looking to address them, like we would with threats that are related to fiat currency or traditional methods, as I mentioned before.
Great, and we'll get to the sort of the recommendations in a moment. And I think honestly that's where a lot of the meat is here in terms of sort of how Treasury, Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence in particular sees sort of obligations in the DeFi space. But it is a risk assessment. So let's at least start with sort of where is Treasury in particular sort of seeing the risks within the DeFi ecosystem for illicit finance?
The risk assessment does identify that there are several instances in which illicit actors like North Korean cybercriminals, ransomware actors, thieves, scammers, drug traffickers are using DeFi services to launder and transfer their illicit proceeds. The risk assessment walks through several techniques that involve DeFi services to do this, including using decentralized exchanges or cross-chain bridges to exchange one virtual asset for another. Maybe the second virtual asset is more liquid and easily exchanged into fiat currency. Maybe it operates on a different blockchain, or maybe it's not able to be frozen by an issuer or something like that. Additionally, we see these actors use mixers, some of which purport to be decentralized. And then also we see sometimes actors place illicit proceeds in the liquidity pools of DeFi services. I think it's also really important to note that in addition to thinking about the money laundering process, which much of the report is focused on, we also do touch on some of the other kind of related issues. So in particular, the fact that illicit actors are also profiting from exploiting DeFi services. So we've certainly seen this in the North Korea context, where North Korean cybercriminals have been particularly adept at stealing money from DeFi services, which is also something that we touch on in the risk assessment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But backing up for sort of 1 second on the money laundering piece in particular, I think that what you're describing essentially is sort of that the layering component, right? Sort of people are, illicit actors are moving funds around the DeFi ecosystem. But you also acknowledge that, and this is something we talk about at TRM all the time, all roads leads to VASPs, right? You're still needing to find those exit points in order to convert those funds into more usable usable fiat currencies to buy stuff, weapons proliferation or whatever North Korea is doing, or any other actors. Could you talk a little bit about sort of that? Because I feel like that's something you do discuss sort of as a mitigation point, and delve into that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, and I think something that's also important to talk about in the DeFi space. I think for two reasons. The first of which is that um, transactions for many DeFi services happen on public blockchains. And so, of course, you have the utility of the data from public blockchains to, in some cases, trace and attribute transactions. I think secondarily, it's important because DeFi services, as you've mentioned, usually don't have any opportunity to access fiat currency, and at present, that's necessary in most cases to, buy goods and services. There's really not a lot at present that you can do with virtual assets, kind of in the purchasing realm. So we definitely consider those two things in the kind of mitigation measure section, aside to the US regulatory framework and the international AML-CFT standards. And I think they're really important to think through. And we do talk about kind of the value of those types of mitigation measures and how they do partially address. But there are shortcomings when talking about the utility of blockchain data. Certainly something, as I've mentioned before, that we think is really valuable. But there are limitations. That data is pseudonymous, which, in many cases, blockchain analytic companies or regulators or law enforcement are able to kind of layer on different types of information to attribute pseudonymous wallet addresses, but that's not always the case. I think one of the other kind of things that we want to consider in kind of assessing those mitigation measures is the use of privacy enhancing technologies on blockchains. It makes sense that not everybody wants their kind of transaction information viewable and publicly developed to look at private blockchains or layer 2 technologies, in which case, the data from the public blockchain isn't as readily available. And so you don't really have that as much as a mitigation measure. So again, we do really think through how these types of factors kind of play into overall thinking about the illicit things, and we end up with some outstanding risk that's not being addressed with all of those measures in place.
Right. Yeah, no, really appreciate that. And obviously that sort of those exit points are one area of potential risk mitigation, right? Those whether they are compliant or not, they have regulatory obligations, those VASPs. Are there other risk mitigation pieces that you explore in the risk assessment?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And a quick note on the kind of off-ramp aspect and the reliance on centralized VASPs, which are more likely to implement AML-CFT measures than DeFi services. But I think one of the things that we've certainly talked about before, and I just want to touch on before going to some of the other mitigation measures, is that very few countries really have licensing or registration regimes at all for virtual asset service providers at present. So many of those VASPs that can serve as off-ramps don't have any obligations. And so that's a key area of concern. That also means that the degree to which kind of reliance on those off-ramps may not, or actually in practice only partially addresses those risks and may still be a vulnerability kind of that's more broadly related to virtual asset illicit finance risk. In terms of the other mitigation measures, so I think we go through a couple in the report. There's the US regulatory framework, the international AML-CFT standards, public blockchain data, and the role that can play. Let's see, there's on and off ramps, and then lastly, AML-CFT and sanctions compliance solutions. And so that just kind of touches on some of the really interesting solutions that we've seen industry come up with. And this was something actually that came up frequently in the request for comment responses for the RFC that we did in September. So looking at things like oracles and digital identity, and things like that I think are really interesting. But again, there are still some limitations to kind of the degree to which those support compliance fully with AML, CFT, and sanctions obligations. And I think, frankly, that's a really key area for public-private engagement moving forward, because I think that will be critical to really getting some of those tools and solutions where they need to be to kind of more fully support that type of compliance. And I think in practice will be more effective at thus mitigating risk.
Terrific. Yeah, no, thank you. So there's obviously sort of the risk piece, the risk mitigation piece, and I get in a moment to some sort of recommendations, but there is a sort of, throughout, I think a discussion of sort of what DeFi's, for lack of a better definition, obligations could be under the Bank Secrecy Act, right? The US government's anti-money laundering regime. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how Treasury sees that today? From some sort of my read, essentially it is really the first, I think, clear explanation from the federal government that the BSA could apply to many DeFi services. And I think that's probably going to be the takeaway in many ways for the industry from this report.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of one of the key kind of ingredients to an illicit finance risk assessment is vulnerabilities. And kind of that's really thinking through how illicit actors are able to misuse DeFi services. What's enabling that to happen? And ultimately, this risk assessment finds that these actors are taking advantage of vulnerabilities in our domestic AML CFT framework in the United States, gaps in implementation of the international AML CFT standards, and weak cybersecurity controls within DeFi technology to conduct their activity. The key vulnerability that we focus on in the illicit finance risk assessment, which you've touched on, is non-compliance by DeFi services that have AML CFT obligations. And we both know very well that when financial institutions that have these types of obligations do not implement them, it essentially means that illicit actors are able to use these types of services without providing identifying information and without really any way for the service themselves or competent authorities to detect and prevent illicit activity. So the risk assessment does provide some pretty basic information, I think, kind of walking through what sanctions obligations and Bank Secrecy Act and related regulations look like in the United States. As you mentioned, the Bank Secrecy Act essentially imposes obligations on financial institutions to help the US government detect and prevent money laundering. The Bank Secrecy Act imposes these obligations on a wide variety of financial institutions like money services businesses, broker-dealers, futures commissions merchants, and whether or not an entity, including a purported DeFi service, is a covered financial institution will depend on the activities that it's providing. But I think kind of the more distilled point to get at your question is the fact that a DeFi service that functions as a covered institution under the Bank Secrecy Act, regardless of whether or not it claims to be centralized or decentralized or plans to be decentralized, will have AML CFT obligations. The really key issue, though, that we're seeing is that in practice, very few are implementing these measures. And as a result, we've seen illicit actors take advantage of that.
So really just sort of digging into this a little bit more. So really what we're saying here is, look, the BSA is activity-based, right? Those obligations are activity-based. So
yes.
If you are engaging in financial services, we don't care if you're centralized or decentralized, you still have those obligations. I say that because, obviously that's definitely the approach that it seems like Treasury is taking, but I think it may surprise some folks within the industry that those obligations exist at all today for the more decentralized part of that spectrum.
No, absolutely. And I think kind of the way to respond to that is maybe twofold. The first is that the risk assessment finds, in line with several other reports that the US government has put out, including those related to the executive order, decentralization in practice is a pretty loose term. And we actually see that many of these DeFi services actually have some kind of centralized control or governance. So I think that's kind of the first element of this. But the second element, which kind of gets to this misunderstanding, I think is really critical here, because we do include and note in the risk assessment that there have been instances in which we've seen essentially VASPs say, look, I want to decentralize because I don't want to have regulatory obligations. And that's not how this works in practice. The services that a DeFi service or any financial institution is providing, the types of services that you're providing can be impacted by the level of centralization. But insofar as you are providing the services of a covered financial institution, you have BSA obligations, centralized or decentralized.
Terrific. I think what you may ultimately hear from folks in the industry is, hey, look, when you're talking about developing software and launching it onto a blockchain, that's very different than sort of having the resources of compliance teams and compliance professionals and CCOs and the like. And I think the challenge is going to be in implementation. But there's definitely a lot in here actually about the potential engagement with industry on sort of solving for some of that. Can you talk a little bit sort of about how Treasury sort of views the potential for engagement now coming out of the risk assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is really a key element of what we're trying to get at here, because I think kind of to the examples that I mentioned before about the idea of decentralizing so as to not have regulatory obligations, I think indicates that there are some misunderstandings in this space, and I think there are some opportunities for some, frankly, pretty fundamental engagement and education on what kind of BSA sanctions obligations look like in practice. I know that several regulators have put out guidance and made public statements and taken enforcement actions, but I think there's still room for additional engagement there. I think also it's important that this engagement inform the consideration of potential additional guidance or regulatory actions to kind of provide further clarity in some instances. I would take issue with many of the kind of claims broadly that there's no regulatory clarity with regards to virtual assets in the United States. As I mentioned before, we've seen several instances of regulators putting out guidance and taking enforcement actions and making public statements. But I do think that there are instances in which it would make sense for industry to have some questions. And I think it's important that those questions or even suggestions maybe be as concrete as possible, because that's where they can actually inform useful conversations. We actually posed several questions at the end of the illicit finance risk assessment to indicate the key things that we're thinking about.
Yeah, I'm not trying to interrupt you. Talk a little bit about that, because I think those are useful. And I guess what I want to understand when I read those is, obviously this is not a consultation, this is not a request for comment, but it sounds like these questions are potentially a jumping off point for industry engagement.
Absolutely. And that's kind of how we saw this risk assessment. I think it's really challenging because it's the first one that we've done on decentralized finance for illicit finance. And I think we frankly had a lot to work through here. But at the end, we're still thinking about some of these really big questions. And I think it's something that we would really benefit from engagement with industry, input from the public on how we can take these steps to answer these questions. These are really going to inform how we are kind of moving forward with the recommended actions that are identified in the risk assessment, and we certainly welcome input on them. I think this is, in a lot of ways, a conversation starter. I know that there have been bits and pieces of this type of conversation happening for a while, but I think we wanted to put a bunch of information in one place and really demonstrate that we are thinking critically about this, and this is kind of where we stand.
Fantastic. So I think you got to this in that sort of last answer, but next steps, obviously, I think you point out several times in the risk assessment that, look, this is not regulation. This is, I like how you kind of characterized it as a conversation starter. How does that conversation continue, whether it's with industry or the public, and ultimately, how does Treasury potentially see this taking shape, down the road in terms of DeFi?
Sure, I think that's a great question. We've got several different kind of engagement opportunities that we're looking forward to. For example, I will be at the Virtual Asset Contact Group, the FATF's working group on virtual assets, next week, where we'll talk about this risk assessment with foreign partners and members of the private sector. And I think that will be a great opportunity to talk about how other countries are thinking about decentralized finance and what their approaches are. And I think a good opportunity to share good practices and challenges that we're all experiencing. I think the meetings with the private sector will also be a good opportunity to start getting feedback. But I think one of the key things that I will mention is that we recognize in the risk assessment that the DeFi ecosystem is changing quickly. And the virtual asset ecosystem more broadly is changing as well. And this does have implications for illicit finance risks and how we're thinking about addressing those risks, and how the US AML CFT framework applies to DeFi services. So it'll be important to continue this public-private sector engagement to really get at that. There are pieces of this puzzle that are difficult for the government types of conversations where we can talk with private sector participants and get their input will be particularly important. And as I mentioned before, I think a key piece of this is kind of talking to the industry. Y'all have a key role to play here. AML CFT obligations and sanctions obligations are only effective insofar as they're effectively implemented. And so we urge you to comply with those obligations, but also come to us with specific and concrete questions or suggestions when you have them. And those are the types of things that can help us consider what other steps are necessary. I think that kind of captures a lot of the recommended actions that were in the risk assessment itself, but I don't want to give them all away in case nobody has anything that they don't need to go read it,
Absolutely. No, terrific. That's my whole thing, right? To digest things and then explain them so people don't have to read things. So, in terms of that, the TLDR, is there anything else that's sort of a key takeaway in terms of those recommendations that you want folks to know, particularly folks who watch, videos as opposed to read lengthy government risk assessments?
Sure. I think some of the key pieces here are the fact that we do see illicit activity happening in DeFi services. That's something we can and should be thinking critically about. We've seen some instances in which people say DeFi shouldn't be regulated. There are illicit finance risks here. And this risk assessment indicates that we find otherwise. So this is important. We are looking at it. And there are obligations for AML CFT in this space, and industry should be thinking critically about that as well.
Terrific. Obviously, there's a lot to digest here, and as we do, I'm really hopeful that we can continue this conversation as you kind of characterized it as a conversation starter, and I hope it's just that. So yeah, would love to continue the conversation and have you on again as we all sort of digest what this means and hopefully build upon that. Thank you. Thank
Absolutely.
you so much for thanks you so much for coming on and for delving into this a little bit with us today.